Good afternoon. My name is Marc Levinson, and I'd like to welcome you to a session that has nothing to do with the law. So we'll see if there's any value here. I'm here to talk about how to write a book, specifically how to make sense of economic change in under 300 pages. This program came out of a discussion with Judge Martin about what might be an interesting presentation for a lot of lawyers who write. And hopefully we'll give you a bit of a different perspective on what this involves. I've got to say, sometimes it seems that the written word is a relic of the 20th century. I don't know to the extent that lawyers share that opinion, but once Judge Martin allows attorneys to tweet their briefs rather than filing papers, you need to be thinking about how to state your arguments more succinctly. My guess, though, is that some of us at least will be writing for a long time to come. There are just too many important things that can't be said in 140 characters. And so I've been asked to talk today about how I went through the process of writing a book and what this entails. I should start by saying that writing is a very personal process. I've done it for a long time. I was for many years a journalist. Subsequently, I've worked in other kinds of jobs where I wrote a great deal. There's no right way to write. I've known writers who chain smoked, but only when they faced an imminent deadline. I've known writers who were simply unable to control themselves and dump thousands of words on an editor and say, "It's yours." I've known writers who fly off the handle if a single one of their precious words is changed. Not too easy to work with. I've actually written, I should say co-written, or maybe I shouldn't say co-written, a lengthy article for a major magazine along with a star writer who, as it happened, couldn't write. And his contribution to the article was to talk to me on the telephone while I wrote down what he had to say and then fashioned it into prose. So writers work in all sorts of different ways. My own method, I've got to say, is pretty linear. I tend to start at the beginning and write a chapter at a time, edit myself as I go, and eventually I come to the end. I can't do 2 chapters at a time. That gets me terribly confused. But there are plenty of writers who don't work that way. I am, in some people's lights, a very disciplined writer. On the other hand, I admit to being quite envious of those who can wake up at 6 o'clock every morning and write 3,000 words before work. I can't get that done. What I'd like to talk about now is my most recent book. It's a book called An Extraordinary Time, The End of the Postwar Boom and the Return of the Ordinary Economy. This is a new history of the second half of the 20th century. And it looks at this time period quite differently from other books I've written. First, it's economic in orientation. I've written about economics for a long time, and this background lets me look at historical events in perhaps a different context from many writers. Second, An Extraordinary Time is a very international book, and it draws heavily on international sources. Again, this is in keeping with my own background and my own thinking. In other words, I think I have a comparative advantage in these areas. And I've deliberately tried to structure my work to play to areas where I think I have some comparative advantage. I don't write about political history or military history or other things like that because, frankly, I have no comparative advantage in those areas. I have nothing in particular to bring that many other people don't. So part of what I do as a writer is try and structure a product in which my unique strengths can come to the fore. This product arose, quite frankly, out of my own irritation at a lot of the other books I'd read on this time period. There's a great deal of literature on the post-war period. It was a time of great ferment, as those of you who are of a certain age may recall. The 60s, the 70s. There have been many, many books on this period, exploring the Vietnam War, the rise of Margaret Thatcher, the fall of the Iron Curtain, the supposed threat that Japan Inc. posed to the United States, on and on and on. Almost all of these books are entirely domestic in focus, and almost all of them fail to provide an underlying economic context. So it was here that I thought I could make a significant contribution. For example, I don't think we can understand the cultural ferment that occurred in the United States and across Western Europe in the 1960s. Anybody remember the 1960s? Few people. Okay, we've all read about it, many of us lived through it, and you can't understand that experience unless you recall that this was an era of almost full employment, not only in the United States, but everywhere in the advanced economies. Why? Full employment gave people the ability to take risks that otherwise they might not have felt free to take. You could quit your job and drop out, go live on a commune, drop out of Harvard and be a carpenter for a while. You could demonstrate, you could do whatever you wanted because you knew it would be easy to find a job when it was all over. Okay? So the strength of the economy during this period was actually very closely tied to these social movements of the time. And conversely, the much slower growth in every country after 1973 was tied to a certain risk aversion. It was no longer the case that you could just find a job, and people did not feel so free to explore their interests and to drop out and try alternative lifestyles and whatever else. So this signaled a different sort of age. So my purpose in writing this book was to retell the history of the 1960s through the 1980s as an economic story on an international scale. I had some background in parts of the story. For example, I had done some research, historical research on deregulation in the United States, which began in the 1970s. But the challenge in creating a book was, how does one tell this story in a way that readers will find interesting and entertaining? Now, I'm not an academic, and so when I'm thinking about my books, I'm thinking about how does one reach a broader audience? How do you get people interested in reading something that, frankly, they don't have to read, and that for most of them is going to be a pleasure read, not an obligation? Well, to me, that requires deciding on the main points I want to make, and then finding stories that illustrate those points. I'm not revealing any trade secrets here if I tell you that readers don't get terribly excited about regression analysis. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever found anywhere in the historical literature, some of you may have read some of the books by the late Barbara Tuchman. Well, she wrote a very small volume called How to Write History. And she has in that book the observation in the space of a single sentence: if you want to argue with the sources, do it in the footnotes. A terrific piece of advice, okay? Most of your readers don't want to read about all this stuff. They don't want to know about this source versus that source and why you weighed the evidence this way and that way and what other people have written on this subject. If you must do that, put it somewhere where the people who really need to know about it can find it and the rest of the people aren't bothered. So you have to figure out how to make a book exciting and interesting to people. The best way to do that, in my experience, is by telling stories about people. People are interested in reading about people. Identifying those people proved to be a particular challenge for me because of the international scale of my book, which is to say, I'm writing about people who are active in some of the economic goings-on in many countries over a period of about 30 years. And most of those names will be unfamiliar to anybody who didn't live in that particular country. So how do you introduce these people? Well, you make them selected people, you make them characters. You develop profiles of them, you describe them. So, for example, I wrote about Gordon Richardson, who was the son of a grocer in Nottingham. And remarkably, he rose in a very stratified society to become the governor of the Bank of England. He was probably the first person to highlight in the late 19th 1960s, early 1970s, the risks that the world faced from the rapid growth of international banking. Turned out to be quite prescient. I devote much of a chapter to François Mitterrand, the French president through the 1980s, who attempted to deal with a stagnant economy first by adopting hardline socialist policies, turning very sharply to the left, and when that didn't work, turning as sharply to the right as Ronald Reagan. And if one can create a picture of these people, can tell stories about them anecdotally, bring them alive, then perhaps readers will be interested in reading about people who aren't in their own country and whose names are unfamiliar to them. Perhaps the readers will accept that figures like these, whom they don't know, had a role in shaping trends in their own country, trends that they do care about. Fleshing out these sorts of profiles can be arduous work. Let me give you an example. One of the people I wrote a profile of as part of this book was a man named Carl Schiller. Schiller was the German economy minister in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And what made Schiller, Germany then was the third largest economy in the world, and what made Schiller interesting to me is that he is an example of many economists of those days who believed that the economy could be treated as what Schiller described as a, quote, rational whole, okay? The economy operated in some sort of rational way, and it accordingly could be steered in a rational way. I spent some time at the German Federal Archives to understand what this meant in practice. What I found was that his advisors spent a lot of time programming computers. Now, this is in the 1960s. Programming computers was a lot of work. And with their careful quantitative analysis, they determined how fast the German economy should grow, what the unemployment rate should be, what the inflation rate should be, what would be the optimal combination for Germany's economy for the next 5 years. And they repeated that exercise every year. And they were going to steer the economy to hit all of these benchmarks that the computer told them that they should hit. We had similar people in the United States and in many other countries, but Schiller was my exemplar. At the same archive, I read about the meetings that he had with union leaders and business leaders and government officials, in which they'd all sit around a table in a room like this, and he would inform them of how much money businesses should invest in the coming year, and what the level of wage increases should be, and whether taxes should go up or down, because all of those things were necessary to reach this optimal growth rate that his economists had determined was where the economy ought to be. I found a handwritten note in the file describing, and I quote, Schiller's almost prophetic image, a very emotional speech. He truly believed that he knew, alone of all people, exactly how the economy should be guided over the next 5 years. And if everybody did their part, the economy would operate rationally, growth would be high, everyone would have a job, and there would be no inflation. This comment reveals the sort of hubris that was very widespread in the 1960s about humans' ability to steer economies. This point becomes important later in my book when I discuss how the public was very disappointed in government's inability to maintain full employment and rapid economic growth, because people like Carl Schiller had told this story that, yes, we can do that. Recession is a thing of the past, unemployment is a thing of the past. All we have to do is treat our economy rationally and guide it as the computers say, and everything will be okay on a permanent basis. So Carl Schiller was one of many people I write about in this book, and try again to do so in an entertaining way. I bring into that a little oral history. For me, as a historian, it's always fun to meet people who were present at the time, who were involved in the decisions that were made. A lot of times they can shed light on what went on. One interviewee can suggest other interviewees, and you also get then a lot of information about the personalities of historical actors. But using oral history can be very tricky for a historian, and I'm sure as attorneys you know this. memories can be faulty. You're talking with someone who was there, or who was talking to you in the best of faith about what they remember going on at the time. Well, maybe they don't remember all the details exactly. Maybe what they're saying is right, but it was not the whole story. It was only a little piece of the story that they saw. So you really can't rely on oral history as a source. It's one of many sources, and you need some archival evidence to back it up. It's very difficult to work with. As I mentioned, I was a journalist for many years, and I've found it useful as an author to draw on journalistic techniques to make a point. Near the start of my book, I have a chapter on the explosive economic growth that began around the world in 1948 and lasted until 1973. How to tell that story. People don't want graphs and charts and regression analyses and all that kind of stuff. Well, to tell that story as a starting point, I chose Arlington, Texas, a city some of you may know, a city I happen to know because my late in-laws lived there. And Arlington, in the post-war period, metamorphosed from a very dusty little town with about 5,000 people to a major city, which has a Major League Baseball team and a four-year state university and about 250,000 residents. Nothing better describes what happened to the advanced economies in the 25 years after the war than the story of this very unpromising little suburb built along a railroad that became a boom town as people moved out of the cities, bought single-family houses, bought cars, saw their standards of living soar. Similarly, when I was looking for a way to depict the anxious response to the Arab oil boycott of October 1973, I came upon the story, long forgotten, of Japan's toilet paper crisis. I doubt too many of you remember this, but back in October 1973, just as oil was in short supply, people were afraid that gasoline was running out, the rumor went around in Japan that toilet paper was running out. There was toilet paper hoarding. The stores sold out. You had fights in stores over the last roll of toilet paper. You literally had people getting stabbed and legs getting broken in the battle to get that last roll of toilet paper in Osaka. I think that gives a sort of vividness to the climate of 1973 that economic statistics can't deliver. Learning to identify potential sources and organize research efficiently are certainly important aspects of working as a historian. The world has many archives and an infinite amount of research material, and a historian has to learn to use research time effectively. I'm sure you have the same issue with your own work and with the work of your associates. And it's also important to filter research. One of the saddest things in reading a historical book is when you get the sense that the author was desperate to use every last index card. Okay, every last piece of information that was dredged up somewhere has to be in the book because I went to the trouble to get that piece of information. That's in general bad news, and one has to filter this. And then, most of all, you have to know when to stop writing. I'm sure all of you have written briefs that could have been better if only you'd had more time. On the other hand, without deadlines, you probably wouldn't have gotten those briefs finished. Now, let me talk a bit about how a book like this moves from conception to reality. I develop an idea, probably a half-baked idea at the start, but the idea will change over time. I do some research. I draft a sample chapter. I draft an outline, which I won't be held to later on, but at least it shows that I think I know where I'm going. And then I send these off to my agent. And my agent plays a key role in this process. My agent, as it happens, has, with years of experience, developed a form which I fill out because I find it very useful. And the form basically asks, why the hell are you writing this book? Who is your audience? Who'd be interested in reading this book? What competing books are there out in the marketplace? What kind of avenues can you suggest for marketing this book if and when it's published? This is a discipline. It forces the author to think very carefully about this project. I don't know if anything like this is applicable in your business, but it's very helpful to know really where you're going. A million people have tried to write books aimed at the general reader. The general reader exists in theory. The general reader is not out there in the book-buying public, and so you actually need to think about an audience in a very specific way and figure out how you're going to reach that audience. Once the agent is satisfied, he takes the sample chapter and the outline and the form and sends it around to different publishers. And the publishers, they come in all shapes and sizes. It's part of the agent's job to know where there's an editor at this publisher who might be interested in a book like this. The publishers employ teams of editors. The agent is trying to identify the specific editors who might be attracted by this kind of proposal. And the agents will come back to him and say, yeah, we don't think we can sell this. Yeah, we think this is a great idea. Yeah, can we do it a little differently than this? With luck, I'll get offered a contract. If it's a very good situation, we'll have several publishers who want to bid on the book, and we'll have a little auction. There's some challenges with this sort of situation, and they do pertain to legal types of things. Okay? One is that while my book is being purchased because an editor loves it, the book's being purchased by the publisher. Okay? Editors move, okay? Particularly younger editors. There's a lot of movement in the book industry. And so here I've got a young man or young woman who just purchased this book. They loved it. They thought they were going to make it a hit. Now they've gotten a job with a different publisher, but their former publisher still controls my book. This is a problem, okay? Because now the publisher has no stake in the book. Or rather, no one at the publisher has a stake in the book. The publisher is still obligated to pay me for the book, but how do I avoid the publisher saying, we're not really excited about this anymore. We're not going to spend time on this. We're not going to market this. Well, that's part of my agent's job, okay? In deciding what publisher we want to work with, one of the things we're likely to assess is whether the editor is going to be around long enough to see the book through the production process. If the editor picks up and leaves, it's the publisher's job to get in touch with the editor's former boss and make sure that that boss is committed to the book. Otherwise, the book can die on the vine. The phrase that's used in the book publishing industry is orphan book. And you don't want your book to be orphaned. This can be a really difficult situation. There are some issues concerning rights that the editor has to negotiate with the agent, the publisher negotiates with my agent. There are issues concerning payment. Okay? There's really very little that's standard in a book contract. And so all of these things get bargained out, and there are ways around problems very often if you've got a creative agent or a willing publisher in terms of the payments, the schedule of payments, what the payments are pegged to. The contract that I have with the publisher typically provides for a delivery date. It typically provides a length, which is not precise, but if we agree I'm going to write 90,000 words, they'll be happy to get 92,000. They're not going to be happy to get 120,000. I'm supposed to deliver the assigned length. And I'm supposed to keep the publisher apprised of changes. The outline will change during the course of writing the book. But if I'm on good terms with the publisher, I'll say, hey, you know, I've decided chapter 7, as I outlined, it really isn't going to work, and I'm going to do this. So we've got some communication. If all's going well, the communication's great. If all is not going well, it's really important to have the agent because, frankly, the agent may have a different channel with the publisher, than I've got. A lot of agents actually have some legal background. It may be a second or third career for some of you, but it's a fairly demanding job because on the one hand, you've got to deal with people like me, and on the other hand, you've got to deal with publishers who I can tell you are even less reasonable than people like me. You've got a contract negotiated. You work on your book, you do your best to submit it on the deadline. And then what? Okay. Now, here's where it starts to get difficult. You've submitted a manuscript that you think works with is in line with what you originally proposed. It works with what your original editor wanted. Is anybody excited about it now at the publisher? Do they want it rewritten? That's bad news if they really hate your manuscript. Are they disinterested in it? I had a learning experience a few years ago when I wrote a book, and I heard back from my editor's assistant. This was a 23-year-old woman who was on her first job. She loved this book. Well, that was terrific for me. It gave me a good lesson. It was terrific because she talked it up inside the organization. So once she thought it was a great book, she talked to the other assistants, and they talked to their bosses, and pretty soon everybody in the organization thought this was a terrific book. It's hard to beat that kind of buzz. One of the benefits of doing that is that then the publisher is willing to put some muscle into marketing. And marketing is really the forgotten part of writing a book. Yes, you do have to come through with your proposal, you have to sell it to a publisher, you have to do your research, you have to put it on paper, or at least metaphorically. But then when your book is finally published, when you've been through the copy editing, when you've argued about whether there should be hyphens here and semicolons there, you have to try and sell the book. And that depends in good part on the publisher. The publisher supposedly has contacts with the media. The publisher knows what journalists might be interested in writing about this book, what blogs might be interested in it, what radio shows might be interested in it. If the publisher is going to put some marketing muscle behind it, you have to be willing to go and do that. You have to be prepared to talk to people. I do a lot of radio shows. Radio is a terrific way to find people who are interested in books, I've learned to my surprise. It's actually a much better way than print media. And so you have to be prepared to work closely with the publisher to market. And frankly, if you're not willing to market, it may not be worth the trouble of writing the book, because there are thousands of books published every year, and many of them drop like a stone. So you have to be out there promoting yourself. You have to be giving the publisher ideas about promoting yourself, helping your book find an audience. And I think this is true for books even in your field. Yes, there are a small number of books that will have a very few readers because they're highly technical. But in general, you're trying to reach an audience. That's the reason for going through this difficult and time-consuming exercise. And if you're not prepared to market, to write articles about the book, to be interviewed about the book, to do presentations, go to conferences, let your friends know about the book, then it becomes very difficult to sell a book. Now, this is a challenging business, and all of you are aware, even if you don't write books, that it's gotten a bit tougher. You've got many independent bookstores out of business now. The book business has been highly concentrated. One company in particular that shall remain nameless accounts for a very large proportion of book sales. You've had a shift of habits between paper books and electronic books and going back to paper books. And in a case like that, the interests of this one very large book retailer may not be consistent with the interests of authors, because the amount of money that I receive, for example, from selling a book in paper may be more than I receive if this particular retailer sells a book electronically. But perhaps it makes more money selling the book electronically, and so it prices the book so that the electronic version sells better than the paper version. That's a typical problem in this day and age. The days of going around to independent bookstores and trying to find audiences are pretty much gone. Even though there's been a minor comeback, there aren't that many independent bookstores around, and word about books doesn't spread that way anymore. At the end of the day, Writing and publishing a book, I imagine, is a gamble, very much like arguing a case in court. I mean, you've outlined your case, and you've written your brief. Metaphorically, you've deposed your witnesses. You've written a very powerful closing argument, and then at a certain point, you lose control. That's probably the hardest part of the business of writing a book. A judge or a jury, in this case, the book market, the readers out there, get to make their decision about whether your book lives or dies, about whether anybody reads it or doesn't read it. And all you can do is watch from a distance. Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk to you about writing and publishing and anything else.
Marc, thank you so much for being here. How do you decide over the course of, you've got your idea, you know what you want the book to be about, but I think one of the hardest things as lawyers and as judges with opinions is how do you decide what to cut out? What is far enough removed or tangential to what you're dealing with that it really impedes what you're trying to do rather than advances it?
Well, let me respond to that in part by giving a writing tip. And I don't normally give writing tips, but this is one I'll give. And it's actually a writing tip that's much easier to deal with now than back in the olden days. I spent much of my life writing for magazines. I was at Newsweek magazine for a number of years before Dahlia Lithwick was at Newsweek. I was at The Economist magazine for a number of years. And in the magazine business, you write to space. Okay? You have 103 lines, or 342 lines, or whatever it is. That's all the lines you get. Okay? And then the photo editor comes into you and says that she wants to run this photograph in this way, and you just lost 72 of your lines. Okay? So that's it. That's your space. So you had your article. You wrote whatever you wanted, but now you've got the problem that you have to take that and you have to fit it into this. It can't be more, it can't be less, it has to fit that space. Okay? Well, books aren't exactly that way, but this is a terrific exercise in writing because you have to learn to edit yourself. You have to learn to fit your ideas to the available space. A writing technique that I recommend very highly to people is to make a game. You have on your word processing program, you can do a word count very easily. You've written something, it's 1,000 words. Challenge yourself to make it 900. Okay? It's easy to tell whether you've gotten there. You just click on word count and it'll tell you. Okay? You've got to take 100 words out of what you've just written. And this answers your question, okay? Because you have to make those decisions right now about what's going to stay in or what's going to go out, because everything can't stay in. You're not going to get 100 words out of there by leaving everything. And so you have to decide right now what's really important, what's really critical, and what's not. And so that is a technique that actually I still use, even though I'm not up against a space constraint. But I will write a chapter. I will see that this chapter is 4,500 words, and I will think that this chapter probably would benefit from being a bit shorter. I don't know how much shorter. So I will go through the chapter again, and it will be my goal to take it from 4,500 words to 4,200 words. And when you do that, you see that this sentence is extraneous, that you had an unnecessary clause in this sentence, that actually this whole paragraph is kind of redundant with what you wrote in the last chapter. You edit yourself as you go along. And that forces you, again, to squeeze out what's really not important. So that's my basic technique. you have to make some larger decisions with respect to the outline. Yes, I'm not going to touch on this topic. And when you see people's comments about books in reviews, often they say, it's too bad the book didn't deal with this, and very often it's because I've made a deliberate decision that I don't want to deal with that. But I really recommend this sort of self-editing technique very highly, because if you have to squeeze down your own word count, you'll figure out what's least important.
I've got two other questions. I'm sorry, go right ahead. I'll pick that up.
I just love the story of the role that luck played. The night your book came out was what night?
Yes, this recent book of mine came out on Election Day. And this was a publisher's decision. It was a decision that was made actually to try and keep the book out of the presidential campaign. Well, you know, you win a few, you lose a few. It's not a scientific business. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned a publisher's auction. You were lucky enough to have several publishers interested. Could you flesh out a little bit what your experience has been with that and how that plays out? Certainly.
Yeah, I leave that up to the agent. He may just send, he's got 3 or 4 publishers who are interested, and he'll send them notes saying, I want your final bid by 12 o'clock on Thursday. He may do something more formal than that. But usually, I mean, this is not a big deal. He's the one conducting the auction. He chooses to do it however he wants. I suppose if I were getting a $5 million advance for a blockbuster novel, it might be a bit different. But this is really totally in the publisher's hands. And what you see is that the publishers tend to have different policies with respect to a couple of things. One is the publishers have many what are called imprints, which is the label. For example, my new book is published by Basic Books. Basic Books is part of a group that owns public affairs books, for example, and several other imprints. The company that owns this would like to avoid bidding against itself. And part of the agent's job is to encourage it to bid against itself by having its imprints bid against each other. And then part of the job is to find a way around whatever some of the publisher's policies are. So the publisher will come up with whatever story, we can't give you more than this because of this policy from corporate, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, so you can't give me more than this money, but suppose you, the publisher, pick up the cost of doing the index rather than leaving it on me, the editor, me, the writer, okay? Or suppose you, the publisher, pick up the cost of the photographs that we're going to put in the book. Or those sorts of things are negotiable, and an agent can negotiate to get around these kinds of restraints. So it's not necessarily, the bids are not necessarily identical just in cash, because there are other things that the publishers can throw into the bids.
Yeah, I am writing a book, so I do have writing tips or questions for you. The first one is, say you've written 50 pages, and you suddenly realize you started out with an outline that you may have 2 separate books, or I need to dump the 50 pages that I just drafted. Have you been through that experience, and what do you do? And my second question is, when I get up to write, maybe my voice changes that day. Someday I'm writing like a philosopher, the next day I write more matter of fact. How do you deal with your sort of emotional changes just day to day? Those are the 2 questions I have.
Okay, I actually have a friend who asked me to read his manuscript. This was about 3 years ago. And I read his manuscript, and I had 2 pieces of advice for him. One was that this was a historical manuscript, and I said you need to be a little bit clearer in your book about what is from your own original research as opposed to stuff you've picked up from other books. And the second was you need to cut your book in half. And he said to me, so how do I cut my book in half? And I said, well, that's your problem, but that's my advice if you want anybody to buy your book. He did this, and actually he came out with 2 pretty well-regarded books from that. Okay? He didn't exactly split it, but he came out with a trade book that was probably 250 pages, and then he came out with an academic book that was probably 300 or 400 pages, and it worked perfectly well. So it's quite possible to do that. In terms of the voice, I tend to edit myself as I go, so I'm back working over a chapter again before I go on to the next one usually. And the voice probably gets pretty much evened out over the course of that. So that's really not a big concern for me. By the time I'm showing it to anybody, I've edited it myself in multiple drafts. And thank God for computers, by the way. I go back to the typewriter and paper days myself. It's a whole lot easier to do this stuff with a computer. You know, you don't really need to start over with a fresh sheet of paper every time you need to do a new draft, so it's a godsend.
I don't know if this applies because you're writing historical pieces, but I wonder, given how long it takes to write a book, given that the political environment or social environment changes over that time, how do you make sure that where you started doesn't become obsolete, or that you don't have to add or change for it to fit where we are today?
Well, it depends what you're writing. I write history, and one of the nice things about history is, at least in theory, history doesn't change. Now, the book that I'm writing, or that I've recently written, has gotten a lot of attention in connection with the recent election, and many of the interviews I've done on it have made reference to the new president. The book was not written with the election in mind, and it really has nothing at all to do with the president, and I did not change the book in any way because of that. The marketing of the book has probably changed a bit because of that, since everybody's talking about the new president. That gets worked into the marketing, and if somebody has you on the radio, it's natural they're going to be asking about that. If I were writing an overtly political book, I probably would have done it differently, but then again, if I were writing an overtly political book, I probably wouldn't have tried to publish it on election day. Yeah. And there is, for many books, if not most, a considerable lead time. Some of the political books have very short lead times because they're actually trying to get them out quickly, but it's not uncommon that you've got a book at the publishers a year or more before it actually comes out. And so you're not going to be up with the news in general. Worst case, you can try to make one or two late changes that don't make the book seem totally out of date. For example, if you quote somebody in the book and that person's died since then. It's happened, you know, the publisher may let you sneak in a couple of words even if it costs the publisher a little money, so you recognize that this person's now dead in limited quantity. But you can't keep up with all the changes. Thank you very much.